May 14, 1916, Rubio, Chihuahua, Mexico. Second Lieutenant George S. Patton crouched behind the corner of an adobe ranch house, his ivory-handled Colt .45 revolver empty. 3 armed horsemen charged toward him at full gallop, carbines blazing. He'd already fired all 5 rounds, click, click, nothing, and while his hands fumbled to reload, 3 bullets cracked past his head, so close he could feel the displacement of air. In that moment, as dust and gunpowder filled his lungs and death charged toward him, the man who would become America's most famous general learned a lesson. That would define his image for 3 decades. The ivory-handled revolvers everyone remembers. They weren't for show. They were insurance against the moment when your primary weapon runs dry, and you're still very much in the fight. To understand why Patton ended up in a Mexican gunfight at age 30, you need to know 3 things. First, in March 1916, revolutionary leader Pancho Villa crossed into New Mexico with about 500 men and attacked the town of Columbus, killing 18 Americans. It was the first foreign invasion of continental United States soil since 1812. President Woodrow Wilson was furious. Second, Wilson ordered Brigadier General John J. Pershing to lead 10,000 troops into Mexico to capture or kill Villa. This became known as the Punitive expedition, and it was America's first large-scale military operation using motor vehicles and aircraft. The U.S. Army was modernizing, and Mexico became the testing ground. Third, Patton wasn't supposed to be there at all. His unit, the 8th Cavalry, wasn't selected for the expedition. But Patton desperately wanted combat experience. He showed up at Pershing's quarters one night and essentially begged for any role, no matter how menial. Pershing asked him why he deserved to go. Patton's answer was simple and honest: "Because I want to go more than anyone else." Pershing, impressed by the young officer's audacity, made him his personal aide. George Smith Patton, Jr. was not your typical second lieutenant. Born into California wealth in 1885, he came from a family with deep military roots stretching back to the Revolutionary War. His grandfather and namesake had been a Confederate colonel killed at Winchester. Young George grew up hearing war stories at the dinner table. But here's the contradiction that made Patton interesting. He struggled terribly with dyslexia at a time when no one understood the condition. He had to repeat his first year at West Point because he failed mathematics. Yet this same man who struggled with basic arithmetic became a master military tactician who could calculate complex battlefield geometry in his head. He was simultaneously insecure about his intelligence and supremely confident in his martial abilities. By 1916, Patton had already made a name for himself in unusual ways. In 1912, he competed in the modern pentathlon at the Stockholm Olympics, finishing 5th overall. There was controversy in the pistol shooting event. Judges claimed he missed the target with 1 shot. Patton insisted, and some historians believed that he was such a fine marksman that his bullet actually passed through a hole he'd already made. Whether true or not, it tells you what he thought of himself. He was also a master swordsman who had studied fencing in France and literally designed a new cavalry saber for the U.S. Army. The M1913 cavalry saber, known as the Patton saber, emphasized thrusting over slashing, a controversial choice influenced by French military theory. The man practiced his pistol technique for hours every day, with both his strong hand and offhand perfecting his trigger pull. He genuinely believed, that he had fought in previous lives as a Roman legionnaire and medieval warrior. Before the Sicily invasion in 1943, British General Harold Alexander told him, "You would have made a great marshal for Napoleon if you had lived in the 19th century." Patton replied without hesitation, "But I did." So when this strange, brilliant, contradictory young officer arrived in Mexico, he wasn't satisfied with staff work. He wanted action. He wanted to prove himself. He wanted more than anything his first kill. And on his belt, he wore a brand new ivory-handled Colt single-action army revolver, 45 caliber, with a 4 3/4-inch barrel. It was extensively engraved by Colt's master engraver, Kuno Helfricht, with his initials GSP carved into the ivory grip. For a second lieutenant making $155 a month, this weapon was a significant investment, but Patton came from money, and he believed in symbols. That revolver was both tool and talisman. By May 1916, the Punitive expedition was struggling. Villa had split his forces into small guerrilla bands and disappeared into the Sierra Madre Mountains. The American troops found themselves chasing ghosts across hostile terrain. Pershing was frustrated. The newspapers back home were starting to question whether the whole operation was a waste of time and money. Then intelligence reports indicated that Captain Julio Cardenas was in the area. This wasn't some random bandit. Cardenas commanded Villa's personal bodyguard, an elite unit called the Dorados, the Golden Ones. He was Villa's second in command. Capturing or killing Cardenas would be a significant victory, proof that the expedition was accomplishing something. Patton wanted this mission desperately. He pestered Pershing repeatedly for permission to join the hunt. Finally, Pershing assigned him to Troop C of the 13th Cavalry. In early April, soldiers from the 16th Cavalry found Cardenas's wife and infant child. At the San Miguelito Ranch, a follow-up search by Patton's troops found Cardenas's uncle at the ranch. According to Patton's own report, they interrogated the man aggressively. The uncle was a very brave man, Patton wrote, and nearly died before he could tell me anything. Whatever information they extracted suggested Cardenas was still in the area. On May 10th, Patton searched the nearby Rubio Ranch but found nothing. 4 days later, on May 14th, Pershing sent Patton on what seemed like a routine supply mission. Take 3 Dodge touring cars, 10 soldiers and 2 civilian guides, and purchase corn for the cavalry horses. It was menial work. Logistics, not combat. But Patton saw opportunity. The corn-buying mission would take him back through the same area, where Cardenas was suspected to be hiding. He wasn't going to waste it. His small force consisted of 1 corporal, 6 privates, 2 civilian drivers, and 2 civilian guides. The guides were crucial, local men who knew the territory. One of them was E.L. Holmdahl, himself a former Villista who had switched sides. They traveled in 3 1915 Dodge Brothers Model 3035 touring cars, open-air vehicles that could reach speeds of 50 miles per hour on decent roads. Each soldier carried a bolt-action Springfield rifle. Patton carried his ivory-handled Colt 45, loaded with only 5 rounds. The practice then, especially with single-action revolvers, was to keep the hammer down on an empty chamber to prevent accidental discharge. So despite having a 6-shot weapon, Patton went into the field with 5 bullets. They successfully purchased corn at the Coyote and Rubio ranches. Nothing unusual. But then Patton noticed something. About 50 or 60 men loitering near the ranches, unarmed but rough-looking. One of his guides, the former rebel, recognized several of them as Villistas. Patton's instincts kicked in. Cardenas was here. He had to be. Patton made a decision. They would search the San Miguelito Ranch again, the same place they'd found Cardenas's uncle. But this time they'd do it fast and hard. He knew the layout from previous reconnaissance. The main house surrounded a large courtyard with an arched gate on the east side. A second, smaller building sat to the south. The key was to block all escape routes simultaneously. What Patton was about to do went beyond his orders. Pershing had sent him to buy corn, not to launch an assault. On a suspected enemy position with only 10 men, a prudent officer would have returned to base, reported the intelligence, and waited for proper reinforcements. That's what the regulations said. That's what a career-minded officer, protecting his future, would do. But Patton wasn't prudent, and he wasn't interested in playing it safe. He saw an opportunity to make a name for himself, to get the combat action he craved, to prove he was more than a staff officer, shuffling papers for a general. He was gambling his career on a hunch. If he was wrong, if Cardenas wasn't there, he'd look like a reckless fool who abandoned his mission for a wild goose chase. If he was right, but the operation went badly, if American soldiers died, on what was supposed to be a corn-buying errand, his military career would be over before it really began. Patton laid out his plan. The 3 cars would approach the ranch from different angles. 2 cars, carrying 8 men, would block the southwest exit, where a low wall provided an escape route. Patton himself would take the remaining car with 1 driver, 1 private, and guide Holmdahl to the northwest entrance, the main gate. The timing had to be perfect. If anyone saw them coming too early, Cardenas would escape on horseback into the desert, and they'd never catch him. The cars needed to move fast, at least 40 miles per hour. to close the distance before anyone could react. This was improvised mechanized warfare, something the U.S. Army had never attempted before. Cavalry doctrine was centuries old. Automobile tactics? They were making it up as they went. The cars roared toward the ranch, engines growling, dust billowing behind them. Patton's vehicle skidded to a stop near the main gate. He dismounted with his ivory-handled revolver drawn. The driver stayed with the car, engine running. The private and Holmdahl moved to support positions. For a moment, everything was still. The courtyard appeared empty. Then someone inside the main house spotted them and started running. Patton heard shouting in Spanish. Suddenly, 3 horsemen burst through the arched gate at full gallop. They'd been saddling their horses, caught but not trapped, and they were armed. The lead rider was charging straight at Patton. The range closed fast. 50 yards, 40, 30, 20. At 20 yards, almost point-blank range for a cavalry carbine, the riders opened fire. Most men would have dove for cover. Patton stood his ground. He raised his Colt, aimed at the lead horseman, and squeezed the trigger. The ivory grip bucked in his hand. His first shot in combat. The bullet hit the rider's arm, breaking it. Patton fired again, hitting the horse. Animal and rider went down hard in a cloud of dust. 2 more riders thundered past him, carbines cracking. Patton fired at them as they passed, then ducked around the corner. He needed to reload. This is where everything went wrong. Patton's hands worked the Colt's loading gate, ejecting spent brass, fumbling for fresh cartridges from his belt. Single-action revolvers are slow to reload, even for an expert. Each round has to be loaded individually. And while he reloaded, the Villistas were still shooting. 3 shots snapped past his head in rapid succession, according to his own account in a letter to his father. The bullets came so close he felt them pass. Any one of those rounds could have ended the career of America's future most famous general. Right there in a Mexican courtyard, but they missed. Barely. In later years, when people asked Patton about his trademark 2-gun rig, he always came back to this moment. During the fray, he told General Kenyon Joyce, "I had to stop and reload my 6-shooter. While I did, 3 shots just missed my head." That's when he decided 1 gun wasn't enough. Never again would he go into a fight with only 1 weapon. But the fight in the courtyard wasn't over. Patton finished reloading and emerged from cover. The second rider was still mounted, trying to control his horse. While leveling his carbine, Patton fired. The horse went down. The rider rolled free, stood up and reached for his weapon. That was a mistake. Several of Patton's soldiers had now joined the fight, their Springfield rifles barking. The Villista went down in a volley of fire. The third rider had made it 100 yards away and was nearly clear. Multiple soldiers opened fire. The distance was extreme for accurate shooting with period weapons. But 1 bullet found its mark. The third rider fell from his horse dead or dying. The first rider, the one Patton had shot in the arm, was now running on foot, wounded but not beaten. This was Cardenas himself, though no one knew it yet. He was making for a low wall, trying to escape. Holmdahl, the guide and former Villista, chased him down. According to multiple accounts, Holmdahl offered Cardenas a chance to surrender. Cardenas raised his hands. Then, in a final act of defiance or desperation, he grabbed for his pistol and fired. The shot missed Holmdahl. Holmdahl's return shot did not. He put a bullet through Cardenas's head. The gunfight lasted perhaps 2 minutes. 3 men were dead, none of them Americans. And when the locals finally identified the bodies, Patton learned that his gamble had paid off. The first man he'd shot, the one who led the charge, was Captain Julio Cardenas, commander of Villa's personal guard, second in command of the Villista forces, one of the most wanted men in Mexico. What happened next would become one of the most controversial images of the entire Mexican expedition. Patton ordered the 3 dead Villistas strapped to the hoods of the cars, like hunting trophies. Cardenas, Juan Garza, who was identified as the second rider, and the third man whose name was never learned, were tied face up across the Dodge's front fenders. Then Patton ordered his small convoy to drive directly back to Pershing's headquarters at top speed. Picture this: 3 open-air touring cars racing through the Mexican desert at 50 miles per hour, raising enormous dust plumes, with 3 corpses lashed to the hoods. Grisly, absolutely. Effective, incredibly. The convoy attracted attention from every American outpost they passed. Word spread faster than the cars could travel. By the time Patton arrived at headquarters, he was already famous. Reporters from American newspapers were waiting. They'd heard something dramatic had happened. When they saw the bodies, they went wild. This was exactly the kind of story that would sell papers back home. Young American officer, barely 30 years old, leads a daring motorized raid, kills Villa's second-in-command in a gunfight at 20 paces. It had everything. Action, technology, the Wild West mystique, a clear victory in what had been a frustrating campaign. The newspapers called Patton a bandit killer. Some accounts were more accurate than others. Several papers incorrectly reported that Patton had personally killed all 3 men. The truth was more complicated. Patton had definitely shot Cardenas and his horse. He'd fired at all 3 men. But with multiple soldiers shooting simultaneously, and all 3 bodies showing multiple wounds, it was impossible to determine with certainty who had fired the killing shots, except for Cardenas. Everyone agreed that Holmdahl had finished him with the headshot. But Patton wasn't about to correct the newspaper's generous interpretation. He carved notches into the ivory grip of his Colt. 3 notches, 1 for each dead man. This detail, more than anything, captures Patton's personality. Part genuine warrior, part showman, always aware of his image. He also took Cardenas's silver-tipped saddle and saber as personal trophies. Years later, Cardenas's spurs would end up in the Museum of World War II in Natick, Massachusetts, tangible evidence of that dusty afternoon in Mexico. Pershing was delighted. Finally a clear success to report. He promoted Patton to first lieutenant on the spot and gave him a new nickname that would stick, Bandito. When Pershing was promoted to command American forces in France the following year, he specifically requested that Captain Patton, now promoted again, come with him as his aide. But the most important consequence of that gunfight happened privately in Patton's own mind. In letters to his father, and in conversations with fellow officers, Patton kept returning to the same moment. Those 3 bullets that missed his head while he reloaded. The helpless feeling of having an empty weapon while the enemy was still shooting. He never wanted to experience that again. He made a firm decision. From that day forward, he would always carry at least 2 handguns. The Colt 45 single-action army would remain his primary weapon, his everyday carry. But he began searching for a second revolver to complement it. Something powerful, something modern, something that could serve as what he called his killing gun, if the primary weapon failed or ran dry in combat. He found it in 1935. Patton purchased directly from Smith & Wesson a brand new registered Magnum revolver in .357 Magnum caliber, later designated the Model 27. The .357 Magnum had only been introduced that same year. It was the most powerful production handgun cartridge available at the time. Patton had the revolver customized with ivory grips matching his Colt, engraved with his initials GSP and his general's stars. For the rest of his military career, spanning World War II and the liberation of Europe, Patton carried both revolvers, the old Colt 45 on one hip, the Smith & Wesson .357 on the other, 2 ivory-handled revolvers that became as much a part of his image as his polished helmet and pearl-handled riding crop, although technically he rarely wore both simultaneously. According to his aides and family members, the 45 was for daily carry. The .357 was specifically for combat situations when he expected to need maximum firepower. The immediate impact of the San Miguelito gunfight was significant but localized. For the Punitive expedition, it was one of the few clear victories. Villa himself was never captured. The expedition withdrew from Mexico in February 1917 without achieving its primary objective, but it accomplished something arguably more important. It gave the U.S. Army its first experience with modern mechanized and aerial warfare. The lessons learned in Mexico, the tactics developed by officers like Patton, would prove crucial when America entered World War I just 2 months after the expedition ended. Patton went to France with Pershing and became one of the first officers assigned to the newly formed Tank Corps, the same aggressive mechanized assault tactics he'd improvised in Mexico. He now applied to tank warfare in Europe. For Patton personally, the consequences were transformative. That gunfight made him famous within the army. It gave him the combat credentials he desperately wanted. It earned him Pershing's favor and patronage, which would prove invaluable throughout his career. And it taught him a lesson about preparedness that shaped his leadership philosophy. Never rely on a single point of failure. Always have a backup. Always have a second weapon, a second plan, a second option. This thinking extended far beyond firearms. During World War II, Patton became known for his obsessive redundancy planning. Multiple supply routes, multiple communication channels, multiple fallback positions. The man who had run out of bullets in a Mexican courtyard made certain his armies never ran out of anything. The ivory-handled revolvers became Patton's trademark. They appeared in countless photographs and newsreels during World War II. They featured prominently in the 1970 film Patton, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture and made George C. Scott a star. There's a famous scene in that movie, based on a real incident, where a reporter asks Patton about his pearl-handled revolvers. Scott, as Patton, delivers the line with perfect disdain. "They're ivory. Only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans whorehouse would carry a pearl-handled pistol." This was a genuine Patton quote, documented by multiple sources, including author Milton Perry's book Patton and His Pistols. Patton was particular about materials and symbolism. Ivory had cultural significance. Pearl was gaudy. The distinction mattered to him. By the time Patton died in December 1945, killed in a car accident in Heidelberg, Germany, just months after the end of World War II, those revolvers had become legendary. They're now displayed in museums and private collections. The original Colt 45 with its 3 notches is at the General Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky. The Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum has been displayed at various military museums over the years. They're pieces of American military history, but they're also reminders of a specific lesson learned on a specific day. May 14, 1916, when a young officer learned that being a warrior requires more than courage and skill. It requires preparation for the moment when your primary weapon fails, and you're still very much in the fight. There's something deeply human about Patton's two-gun philosophy that transcends military tactics. How many of us have faced a moment when our first plan failed, when our primary solution didn't work, when we ran out of ammunition, metaphorically speaking, and the problem was still charging at us? Patton's response wasn't to freeze. It wasn't to accept defeat. It was to ensure it never happened again. To build redundancy, to always have a backup. The revolvers weren't really about firepower, though that mattered. They were about psychology, about confidence, about knowing that if one solution fails, you have another immediately available. You don't have to retreat. You don't have to wait for help. You can keep fighting. That's a lesson that applies far beyond battlefields. In business, in relationships, in creative work, in life, the people who succeed are often the ones who always have a backup plan, a second option, another way forward when the first path is blocked. But there's a darker side to consider too. Patton's obsession with preparedness sometimes tipped into paranoia. His need for control, for multiple contingencies, for never being caught vulnerable, made him an effective general but a difficult human being. He trusted few people. He pushed subordinates mercilessly. He collected enemies. The man who learned in Mexico to always carry a second gun never learned to relax his guard, even when the fighting was over. The psychological cost of constant readiness is exhaustion. So perhaps the real lesson isn't just about carrying two guns. It's about knowing when you need them and when you don't. About finding the balance between preparedness and peace. About understanding that the fight you're training for might not be the fight that actually comes. If you found this story fascinating, you might enjoy learning about other moments that defined Patton's career. Check out our video on how he orchestrated the Third Army's legendary pivot. During the Battle of the Bulge, a maneuver military historians still study today. It's another story about preparation meeting opportunity. If you want more deep dives into the real stories behind famous military figures, subscribe and turn on notifications. We research the moments that textbooks skip over, the decisions that changed everything, the details that make history human. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the most important equipment isn't the weapon you fire first. It's the one you have when everything else runs dry.